This morning, we're pleased to hear again Michael Ruse, who I was out of town yesterday and was unable to come to the session last night, but I understand that he was well introduced last night, so I will give just simply a brief introduction to him again this morning. Michael received his PhD from the University of Bristol, currently is professor of zoology and philosophy of science at the University of Guelph, and is the author of hundreds of technical articles and books, and was the key witness on the Darwinist side in the Arkansas trial concerning the Balanced Treatment Act.
Oh, I've got to have that little music-y, I think. How's that? Okay? That's the last time anybody's going to say something that I'm doing is wonderful around here, I suspect. Well, I don't know about you folks, but this is the first time I've given an 8:15 lecture. At Guelph, we reserve that just for our agricultural students. For a long time, we used to have 8 o'clock classes on the list, but we just used to give those to people who'd got tenure, but we wished that we hadn't given tenure to. Now, the Arts College doesn't have any 8 o'clock classes at all. However, here I am, and I keep telling myself that in the real world, that's to say in Eastern Standard Time, it's really 9 o'clock, so it's okay. Well, I was asked to talk on the topic of Darwinism, philosophical preference, or scientific inference. And I said, my goodness me, isn't it both? Would it be acceptable if I gave a paper which said it was both? And there was a long silence, and I guess that they'd had trouble finding participants, so they said, well, if you must, you must. And so that's what my talk is today. It's Darwinism, philosophical preference, scientific inference, and good research strategy. So you know where I'm coming from, folks. I'm on Darwin's side. In 1859, Charles Darwin published his great work on the origin of species. He claimed that all organisms, including ourselves, are the products of a slow natural process of development, evolution, from just one or a few forms. As you might imagine, much that Darwin had to say has been revised in the course of a century and a half of research. But I think that in essence, Darwin was right. In this paper, I shall defend my beliefs. I'm interested here only in the positive case, and therefore shall have nothing to say of a negative nature about those who do not share my beliefs. I am sure they can speak for themselves, and I welcome the opportunity to let them. But by God, when it comes to discussion time, folks, I'm going to get my knives out. I shall divide my discussion into 3 parts. That's my Christian background. That dealing with everything I think of it comes in 3s. It's either dialectical or Christian, one or the other. Into 3 parts. That dealing with the underlying philosophical commitment to science, that dealing with the fact of evolution, and that dealing with the belief that the right scientific strategy is the Darwinian one, referring here to Darwin's major mechanism of natural selection. Right, so the first part is the commitment to science. I am not a scientist, but I believe that the proper and most profitable way to explore and understand this wonderful world of ours is the scientific one. I'm not implying that scientists are better or worse people than the rest of us, but I do think that their methodology is the best one. By scientific methodology, or attitude in this case, I mean a commitment to the idea of the world being law-bound. That is to say, subject to unbroken regularity, and to the belief that there are no powers, seen or unseen, that interfere with or otherwise make inexplicable the normal workings of material objects. Let me just emphasize that, because that's where I make my stand, that I think that the important thing about science is understanding through law. And I should qualify what I just said. I'm certainly not denying the importance, say, of poetry or of music or any of these sorts of things. I'm talking about understanding the way that the world works. I'm not trying here for a trick definition and include such things as gravity and electricity in the material world. I recognize and am thrilled at the fact that the world is full of mysterious things like electrons. It's just that they're not so mysterious as to lie outside law. I take it that my position excludes certain sorts of miracles, for instance, Jesus turning the water into wine, taken in a literal sense. On the other hand, if your miracle does not interfere with the workings of nature, and if you do not make any scientific claims for your beliefs, I have nothing to say qua my commitment to science. For instance, I see no reason why one should not be a scientist in my sense and believe in the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation, the belief that the water and wine turn into the body and blood of Christ during the Catholic Mass. No priest would ever claim that you cut open the loaf and flesh oozes out. The Aristotelian distinction between substance and accident lies beyond science, as I am understanding it. You understand, I'm not saying that I believe in transubstantiation, it's just that a miracle of that kind I don't see as conflicting with science as I've characterized it here. Is my position reasonable, provable, irrational, or just a philosophical preference? It is certainly not provable in the sense that the theorem of Pythagoras is provable. It is not provable in the sense that one can prove that the earth goes round the sun. It is the presupposition of that particular claim. On the other hand, I deny that it is merely an irrational prejudice, or even just a philosophical preference, although you must recognize that I am prejudiced here because I am a professional philosopher, a claim which takes on a certain edge in view of yesterday evening's discussions. Sometimes you have beliefs that you cannot prove absolutely, but which are still reasonable in the sense that you can offer good arguments. Political beliefs probably fall into this category. But let me take the less contentious, or perhaps it is more contentious in a place like Dallas, the case of preferences about sport. Is baseball a better game than cricket? You notice that I did not talk about American football as opposed to soccer. I mean, I may be foolish, but not that foolish in a place like this. Is baseball a better game than cricket? Ultimately, there is no way of deciding. Some people like cricket and some people like baseball. But you can offer some reasons for your preference. For instance, a strong argument in favor of baseball is that the game gets finished. You do not go on 4.5 days, have the game in the balance, and then get everything washed out, literally, by the English weather. I think this is very important. I'm saying that there are some things where ultimately it's preference, I think, but that it doesn't mean to say that you can't have a reasonable argument about this and can't be persuaded by the arguments. For instance, the game of cricket, for instance, now we have one-day cricket. They've just concluded a very successful World Series of this, where the game does have a conclusion. But again, there are people who would argue very strongly that you lose something in doing this, that a great test match which goes on for 5 days has a drama which is lost in a one-day game. So as I say, that was not intended to be a joke, if you don't mind. I realize I am a foreigner, but I am a guest in your country. It's all right, he's on my side, I can be rude to him. I don't have to be polite. In the same way, you can offer an argument for the reasonableness of the scientific attitude. A great many things which in the past were thought miraculous are now seen to be covered by law. To take but one example, it was thought by the well-to-do in New York City in the last century that typhoid was a miraculous punishment by God of the Irish and other poor immigrants for their dissolute lifestyles and stubborn adherence to popery. Now we know that it was only the bottom segment of society which had to drink the stinking contaminated water. There was no miracle about that or about the diseases that the lowest group members thereby contracted. Of course, you can always say that there was no miracle then, but there is a genuine miracle coming up around the next corner. I just say that it is not reasonable to believe this. The mature attitude is to go with unbroken law. So I'm saying that I think I accept that a belief in law is not something which can be given ultimate justification, but it doesn't mean to say that it's just a prejudice or it's just up for grabs or something like that, that I think that one can give an argument, as for instance one can give an argument for the preferable way of the Canadian way of life over other third world countries. There's one final thing, of course I'm not talking about the rest of the US, you understand. There's one final thing I should say before I move on. I recognize that having a commitment to law is one thing. It is another thing to put such a commitment into effect. I do not want to write an essay here about scientific method, but obviously what I am presuming is that the working scientist will be testing his or her hypotheses against the world of experience, which may well include the manipulated world of experience of the experimenter. And to guide him or her, the scientist will be relying on well-established rules of scientific method, the appeal to consistency, the preference for simplicity, the aim for comprehensiveness. This last dictate I take to be very important indeed, especially in the kind of case we are about to consider here. Scientists aim to include all of their subsidiary hypotheses beneath one or two major, all-embracing laws. The paradigmatic example of such a consilience of inductions was Isaac Newton's showing that the terrestrial mechanics of Galileo and the heavenly dynamics of Kepler could be subsumed beneath shared laws of motion and of gravitational attraction. The status and proof of such laws of methodology have been matters of some debate. I myself favour an explanation which roots the rules in our evolutionary past, but that is not a significant issue here. I agree that the rules are not provable absolutely in logic, but with a general commitment to lawfulness, I argue that, as with a general commitment to lawfulness, I argue that their acceptance is more than a matter of arbitrary whim. Return for a moment to the baseball analogy. Although I accept that there is an element of subjectivity about the baseball case that is missing in the case of science, that despite what Stephen Jay Gould thinks, I don't think that baseball are the laws of God quite in the way that science is. Even though it is true that you cannot prove absolutely that some rules of baseball are necessary, through long experience you know that unless you have the rules, and rules of a certain kind, your game will cease to function in the way that you expect of a top-notch sport. If, say, a runner did not have to touch all the bases on his way round, or these days on her way round, baseball simply would not work. The same is true of science with respect to simplicity and consilience and the like. Science will not work without rules, and experience tells us which are the best rules. I think there's some interesting questions here about the subjectivity, say, of something like baseball and the question of science. I mean, for instance, in baseball you have a big argument over, say, the designated hitter rule, which, clearly, I mean, the American League has it, the National League doesn't. Now, is there a subjectivity there about science? Some people would say no, there isn't, whereas others would be much more inclined to say perhaps there is, and certainly something like quantum mechanics shows that scientists likewise have had to play around with their rules, and whereas some were prepared to be American leaguers, others were National Leaguers, and so one does in fact get a conflict here. The point is, in both cases, I don't think it's just purely subjective. I don't think it's purely, if it feels good, go with it. I mean, what we find is, through long experience, is certain things work better than others. And sometimes you have rules where you simply say after a season or two, look, this looked like a good idea, but clearly it's a lousy idea. Let's give it up and go back to something else. Instant replays, for instance. The fact of evolution, this is my second section. Grant now that one is going to accept the scientific way of thinking. The next question is, what should we believe about origins, organic origins, including ourselves, that is? There's a range of options. Logically, it could be the case that life is as old as the universe, that it has always existed in the present form. The point I'm making is that because you're a scientist, it doesn't seem to me logically necessarily, therefore you've got to be an evolutionist, logically. It could be that life is as old as the universe, it has always existed in the present form. This includes the possibility that the universe is eternal. Or it could be that life comes into being spontaneously on a regular basis, a kind of organic equivalent to the steady-state universe. It could even be that limbs and the rest form by pure chance out of randomly moving molecules, and that these sometimes join together to make functioning organisms. This was the belief of the Greek atomists, who reasonably thought that if one had infinite space and infinite time, anything might happen. I do not myself believe any of these things. Everything I know, and I admit that I get it all at second hand, suggests that the universe was formed about 20 billion years ago in a big bang, that everything has been expanding and evolving ever since. But remembering now that I take the scientific attitude for granted, why go on to accept organic evolution? Why accept that all organisms came about through a natural process of development? Why believe that we humans had monkeys for grandfathers? Or grandmothers, for that matter. Not monkeys, of course, of a kind which are living today. If challenged with this point, many people, especially those who are not professional evolutionists, would say, because of the fossils. They would think that the record of the rocks is the ultimate ground for belief. However, along with the professional evolutionists, I would cast my net much wider. If you want to find out about life's history, the fossil record is invaluable. If you want to find out what our ancestors were like, then you must go and dig up the bones in Africa. Today, we have, although of course we have many other techniques for inferring organic histories, phylogenies, often techniques involving the molecules, but the fossils clearly remain crucial. But I'm as an evolutionist as such because of all of the evidence, and this goes back to the point I was making about unification, consilience. I find particularly convincing the evidence of morphology. Why is it that the limbs of vertebrates, used for all sorts of different purposes, have the same isomorphic pattern of bones, homologies? Why do we find repetition between the forelimb of the human, a grasping instrument, the front leg of the horse, a running instrument, the flipper of the whale, used for swimming, the wing of the bat, used for flying, and more? My answer is that if you think in terms of unbroken law, then evolution makes the most sense. Like Darwin himself, I find very impressive the facts of biogeographical distribution. That famous group of islands in the Pacific, the Galapagos Archipelago, has different species of finch from island to island, and mockingbird as well. It turns out, incidentally, that it wasn't the finches which turned Darwin to evolution, it was the mockingbirds. How could this be? How could there be these different but similar? How could it be other than through the gradual development from shared ancestors? If you think in terms of seeding from outer space or spontaneous generation or some such thing, there is no reason why the finches appeared thus so close together. Why not one species of finch in the Galapagos and another in the Hebrides, for instance? Am I making this claim about evolution as a matter of absolute logical necessity, given the commitment to science? The phrase I like is that of the lawyers, beyond reasonable doubt. I should say, in my own defense, I've been using this phrase for 25 years. I didn't think it up specially just to make Philip Johnson either happy or particularly mad. The phrase I like is that of the lawyers, beyond reasonable doubt. I think that the fact of evolution is beyond reasonable doubt. There is no need for the student of biology to take seriously, say, the hypothesis of spontaneous generation of whole forms. Ideas like that have been considered and discredited. You will recognize here that I'm appealing to the consilience of inductions. My claim is that evolution brings many disparate parts of biological science together, unites them beneath one all-embracing hypothesis, and that it is not reasonable to go on questioning. Continuing the legal analogy, you will realize that this is precisely what we do in a court of law, especially when we are dealing with circumstantial evidence. The guilt for the murder is pinned on the butler, say, because of the fingerprints and the bloodstains and the broken alibi and the motive and everything else. All of these make sense on the hypothesis of the butler's guilt. Likewise, evolution is a reasonable belief because of the homologies and the biogeographical distributions, and all the rest makes sense on the hypothesis of the truth of evolution. The butler's guilt and the truth of evolution are beyond reasonable doubt. The truth of evolution is not a logical necessity. As in law, new evidence could lead one to reconsider even a verdict decided as beyond reasonable doubt. But it's going to take a lot of evidence of a very strong nature. I'm not holding my breath in anticipation. I would put the chances of my being wrong on this point about on a par with my favorite tabloid being right, that Elvis is indeed alive and well and living in retirement in Florida. God, there was a silence there. Maybe you know that. Sorry about it. Okay, well. I haven't cowed you so much. You are allowed to laugh at the intentional jokes. Okay, final section. Darwinism is the best scientific strategy. Darwinism is the best scientific strategy. We come now to the question of theories or causes. Supposing that one is an evolutionist, what drives the process? There have been lots of suggested mechanisms: natural selection, Lamarckism, the inheritance of acquired characters, saltationism, that's jumps, orthogenesis, directed trends, drift, that's random meandering, and more. True to my intentions, I am neither going to list all of the options nor refute them. I am concerned with my position, Darwinism, and why I think it is the right choice. My answer centers on what I think is the most important aspect of organic nature, separating it off from the rest of reality. Organisms work, they function. They are as if designed. They have adaptations. It makes no sense to ask about incidentally, just to plug, the book that I've edited, But Is It Science, has an article by Richard Dawkins there, which many people have criticized, but certainly I think is a very powerful argument, and I would like to think I didn't just lift my argument from Dawkins, but that this is a case of homology, perhaps of common ancestry. Organisms work, they function, they are as if designed, they have adaptations. It makes no sense to ask about the function of the craters on the moon. It makes every sense to ask about the function of the sail on the back of Dimitrodon. I have said that organisms are as if designed. Am I suggesting that they are not designed? No, nor am I saying that they are designed. My point is simply that, as one following science, if talk of a designer implies someone who got involved miraculously in the process, this is simply inappropriate in this context. So do note what I am saying. I am not denying the existence of a designing God. I'm not asserting it either. I'm just leaving that on one side. But I am saying that the fact that the as-if designed is very important and calls, within the scientific context, for a naturalistic explanation through law. One must explain the adaptedness of organisms by natural means. This one can do by invoking natural selection, the differential survival of certain organisms against a background of modern genetics. Originally this was Mendelian genetics, but now we think that ultimately all can be referred back to long changes of ribonucleic acid, DNA and RNA. I believe that for reasons not connected with their needs, organisms vary. There's a constant pressure of population leading to competition for resources and mates, the struggle for existence. Some organisms survive and reproduce, some do not. Those that do succeed have, on average, variations not possessed by the losers, and those variations, although they appeared for no good reason, I'm not saying they're uncaused, but I'm saying that they appeared for no reason that the possessor had in mind, although they appeared for no good reason, help the winners to win. Given enough time, since the variations are heritable, one gets evolution. More significantly, and I think that this was Darwin's genius move, one gets the evolution of adaptations. The argument is simple, but not simplistic. It is true, but not a truism. It is one of the most beautiful and powerful discoveries ever made by a human being. That is why I'm proud to be called a Darwinian. It is not just that natural selection explains the world that we know already, but like the very best scientific ideas, it contains potential for explanation in new areas of inquiry. In the last 30 years, for instance, Darwin's selection has been introduced into our study of social behavior in a major and most satisfactory manner. Such old problems as, for example, the structure of the hymenopteron nest, that's ants and bees and wasps, are now seen in an altogether new and revealing light. Does this mean that I believe that natural selection is the exclusive cause of evolutionary change? If I did, I would be the first person ever to do so, and I'm not about to set any records here. I see no logical reason why every last aspect of the organic world should be adapted, and I very much doubt that it is. Perhaps it is the case that, to take the example which always comes up, that male nipples have some adaptive function. But myself, I rather doubt it. Even the sexual argument does not convince that well, if we didn't have male nipples, then we wouldn't be attractive, etc., etc. It seems to me quite plausible that there are reasons of change other than direct selective advantage, correlation with other desirable features, byproducts from changes of unrelated organs, or just plain chance. This latter might be very important at the molecular level, although do not ask me how important. I am sure that natural selection is very important. I am sure it is the most important. I doubt that it is the exclusive cause of evolutionary change. I have spoken in my heading to this section of Darwinism as a strategy, and that is precisely what I mean. I think that it is true. More importantly, I know that it works. It explains the world that we know, and it leads us into new realms of the world that we do not know. It makes sense as a scientist, as an evolutionist, to back it for all that it is worth. That is what sensible strategies are all about. So, in conclusion, as promised, I've simply stated what I believe. Let me merely say one final thing. I've offered my ideas in a true state of reverence. You may not agree with them, that is your right, and we can now start a debate. What I do say now, and shall always maintain, is that whether or not there is some meaning to life above and beyond us all, whether or not there is this, great creations of the human spirit in themselves confer a meaning and significance to human existence. They dignify us, just as obscenities like the Holocaust degrade us. Even if we are all destroyed tomorrow, nothing could negate the nobility of Plato's Republic, the beauty of Mozart's Don Giovanni, or the heady excitement of Darwin's hypothesis of organic evolution through natural selection. I am proud to be human. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Our next speaker, in response to this talk that you've just heard, is Stephen Meyer. He has a PhD in the history and philosophy of science from Cambridge University, where he completed a thesis on the logical structure of evolutionary argument and historical sciences. He previously worked for several years as a geophysicist at Atlantic Richfield before leaving for England to study on a Rotary Fellowship. He writes frequently on philosophy, science, and public policy, and has, in addition to many technical journals, written for more popular media such as Los Angeles Times and the Wall Street Journal. He currently teaches philosophy and history of science at Whitworth College in Spokane, Washington.
I appreciate very much the opportunity to respond to Professor Ruse. Though it's in the nature of a response to disagree, I must say that I've always appreciated his work in philosophy of biology. His arguments are presented extremely forcefully and cogently, and because of this, they've always served to clarify my own thinking, even when I find myself on the opposite side of a particular philosophical issue. As a philosopher of science, I also appreciate the title of Professor Ruse's paper, for I too believe that an idea can be both a philosophical preference and a scientific inference. Recent work in philosophy of science on something called the demarcation problem suggests that it may be very difficult to separate philosophy and science, especially since both of these enterprises share a common concern with explanation. Establishing a rigid line of demarcation between science and philosophy is especially difficult in the vexing world of origins research. So I appreciate Professor Ruse drawing our attention to what is perhaps a false dichotomy in the title of this conference, the one between scientific inference and philosophical preference. Nevertheless, my philosophical preferences are somewhat different than Professor Ruse's, and it will be part of the purpose of this response to suggest that inferences with a decidedly theistic implications may be also considered properly scientific. In fact, I would like to suggest that Professor Ruse's definition of science certainly serves certain philosophical preferences, but it does not always promote theoretical openness, nor as a result intellectual rigor. Now that is, of course, a serious disagreement. And so I should say in passing that having lived in England myself and seeing many long hours of cricket rain delay on the television, I was at least relieved to hear that he shares my preference for baseball over cricket. Perhaps that'll provide a common ground for the discussions about our differences that I hope we can have. Though I work at a school with a Presbyterian background, I have only 2 points. I want to challenge Professor Ruse on 2 things. Number 1, his definition of the scientific attitude, and number 2, his assertion that evolution, defined as common descent, is a fact. Now first, my challenge to his definition of science. Professor Ruse has stated that to adopt the scientific outlook, one must accept that the universe is subject to natural law, and that further one must never appeal to an intervening agency as an explanation for events. Instead, we must always look to what he calls unbroken law if we wish to explain things as scientists. Now there are several problems with this assertion from the standpoint of philosophy of science, and especially with the so-called covering law conception of science, which underlies Professor Ruse's remarks and to which he appeals. Indeed, unsolved problems with this covering law idea of science are legion, and it can be no purpose of mine this morning to recite all of them. Nevertheless, one of the more salient difficulties with this philosophy of science, i.e. this theory of what constitutes a proper scientific theory, is relevant to my critique of Professor Ruse's suggestion that science is primarily concerned with explanation via natural law. And that is the key phrase, explanation via natural law. There are 2 problems with this notion. The first is that many explanations in science are not rendered in terms of natural law. And the second is that many laws are not explanatory, rather they are descriptive. Now that is not to say that the world is not law-governed. I'm not calling that into dispute. I am just calling into dispute the equation between laws on the one hand and explanations on the other. Now as I said, there were 2 sides to this. In the first place, many laws are descriptive rather than explanatory. Many laws describe regularities but do not explain why the events they describe occur. A good example of this is Newton's universal law of gravitation, which Newton himself freely admitted did not explain, but instead merely described gravitational attraction. As he put it in his famous Latin phrase, hypothesis non fingo. That is, I don't know the cause. But secondly, there's a more important problem. Laws cannot be equated with explanations or causes because many scientific explanations do not depend either principally or in some cases at all upon scientific laws. Many scientific explanations depend primarily upon citing antecedent causal conditions and events, not laws, to do what I call the primary explanatory work. That is to say that citing past causal events often does more to explain a particular phenomena than citing the existence of a regularity in nature. That is in part because many things do not come into existence via a series of events that regularly recur. If an historical geologist, for example, seeks to explain the unusual height of the Himalayan mountains, he will cite particular antecedent factors that were present in the case of the Himalayan orogeny, but that were not present in other mountain building episodes. Similarly, an historian of human history, in seeking to explain why World War I began, whether in terms of the ambition of the Kaiser's generals, the Franco-Russian Defense Pact, or the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, will invariably and primarily involve in his explanation the citation of events, of conditions or actions that are believed to be causally prior to the events that he wishes to explain. Indeed, as Michael Scriven has shown, we can often know what caused something even if we cannot relate causes and effects to each other in formal, nomological, or law-like statements. Another philosopher of science, William Alston, has shown that laws alone do not explain particular events, even when we have them. Thus, he concludes that to equate law and explanation is to commit a category mistake of the most flagrant sort. Now, this may be a little arcane tapping into philosophy of science, so perhaps another example will help. If I wish to explain why men were able to fly to the moon, when apples usually fall to the earth, I will not primarily cite the law of gravity. Such a law is far too general to be primarily relevant to explanation in this context, because the law allows for a vast array of possible outcomes, depending on the initial and boundary conditions affecting the apples and the astronauts. The law stating that all matter gravitates, according to an inverse square law, is consistent both with apples falling and with astronauts flying to the moon. Explaining why the astronaut flew when apples routinely fall, therefore, requires more than citing the law, because the law is presumed operative in both situations. Accounting for differing outcomes between the apple and the astronaut will require references to prior conditions and events which differed in the two situations. In other words, explanation in this case requires an accounting of the way in which engineers have altered the initial and boundary conditions affecting the astronauts to allow them to overcome constraints that are ordinarily imposed on all earthbound objects by gravity. Now, confusion about the role of antecedent conditions and events on the one hand and laws on the other in scientific explanation has led many to create a false dichotomy between unbroken law and the action of agency. In Professor Ruse's case, this dichotomy is manifest in his assertion that invoking the action of a divine agent constitutes a departure from a commitment to natural law. I disagree. Posing the actions of agents, whether seen or unseen, versus natural law is an unnecessary dichotomy. The reason for this is simple. Agents can change initial and boundary conditions, yet in so doing they do not violate laws. Most scientific laws have the form, if A, then B, given some set of boundary conditions, X. If the conditions X are altered, or if A did not occur, then it constitutes no violation in the laws of nature to say that B did not occur, even if we expected it to. Agents may alter the course of events or produce novel events which violate our expectations without violating the laws of nature. To assert otherwise is merely to overlook the distinction between antecedent conditions and laws. The tendency to conflate or equate laws with causes on the one hand and to treat natural laws and agency as mutually exclusive ontologies on the other has produced a confused set of expectations about what scientifically acceptable origins theories must look like. This confusion has been heightened by the positivistic tendency to see all scientific practice as identical. I call this cookie-cutter science. and by talk about the scientific method, the scientific method. In my own research, I have argued that a clear and logical distinction exists between questions that motivate historical and non-historical, or what might be called nomological, science. Whereas nomological science, the science concerned with law generation, raises questions of the form, how does nature normally operate or function? Historical science addresses questions of the form, how did natural feature X arise or originate? This distinction has important implications for evaluating the scientific status of theories which invoke an intelligent cognitive act as a scientific explanation. I personally think that it suggests the legitimacy of such postulations if they also possess features such as wide explanatory power, internal consistency, coherence, and simplicity. Let me explain. When a research program concentrates on questions about how nature normally, i.e. unassisted by agency, operates, any reference to agency, whether divine or human, becomes inappropriate because it fails to address the question of interest. To propose a divine act or a human act where a nomological relation or law is required simply misunderstands the character of nomological science and the question motivating it. Neither divine nor human action qualifies as a law. To offer either when a law is sought is clearly inappropriate. On this, I believe both theists such as myself and people who take a more agnostic position can agree. It is not at all clear, however, that references to agency are similarly inappropriate when reconstructing a causal history, i.e. when attempting to answer questions about how a particular feature of the natural world arose. In the first place, many fields of inquiry already routinely invoke actions of agents to account for the origin of features or events within the natural world. Forensic sciences and investigations, history, archaeology, and many others all sometimes postulate past and unobservable activity of human agents to account for the emergence of particular events or objects. Such fields suggest a clear precedent for inferring the past activity of intelligent agents within the historical sciences. Imagine the absurdity of someone claiming that the scientific method had been violated by the archaeologist who first inferred that Rosetta Stone inscriptions had been produced by human beings rather than by natural forces such as wind and erosion. There is a second reason that postulating the past action of agency may be appropriate in the historical sciences. That has to do with the nature of historical explanation in those sciences. Historical explanations require first and foremost the postulation of antecedent causal events, as I've mentioned. They do not seek to infer laws, though they may invoke laws in a subsidiary way to enhance or justify the plausibility of a postulated causal scenario. To offer past agency as part of an origin scenario or explanation is therefore at least logically appropriate, because it offers the type of theoretical entity that is required by an historical explanation. Simply put, past agency is a causal event, and historical explanations ask for information about past causal events. Agency, therefore, may serve as a valid theoretical entity in an historical theory, even if it could not do so in a nomological or inductive one. Mental action may be a cause, even if it certainly is not a law. Now, because of this, I would like to press my case against Professor Ruse's prohibition against agency in science even further. I would like to argue that to exclude intelligent design a priori as a working hypothesis in, for example, historical biology is actually anti-intellectual. Unlike Darwin, many modern Darwinists can scarcely bring themselves to consider the possibility of intelligent design, let alone actually argue against it as he did. Professor Ruse, to his credit, who has spent many long hours directly confronting various creationist heresies. Yet he fails in this paper to mention intelligent design as on his list of scientific possibilities. Yet it must be mentioned that this is precisely the theory that Darwin himself spent most of his time arguing against. Indeed, it must be acknowledged that it is at least logically possible that a personal agent existed before the appearance of the first life on Earth. It is therefore at least logically possible that such an agent, whether visible or invisible, influenced the origin of life on Earth. To insist that postulations of past agency are inherently unscientific in the historical sciences, where the express purpose of such inquiry is to determine what actually happened in the past, suggests that we know that no personal agent could have existed prior to man. Not only is such an assumption intrinsically unprovable, it is entirely gratuitous metaphysically in the absence of some non-circular account as to why science should presuppose metaphysical naturalism. Moreover, to exclude by assumption a logically possible answer to the question motivating historical science is anti-intellectual and theoretically limiting, especially since no equivalent prohibition exists on the possible nomological relations that science may postulate in the non-historical sciences, i.e. those concerned with law generation. Now, there is one final reason that a priori exclusions of design are, in my opinion, anti-intellectual, indeed even unscientific. Recent non-positivistic accounts of scientific rationality suggest that scientific theory evaluation is an inherently comparative enterprise. Notions such as consilience, which Professor Ruse mentions, and Peter Lipton's idea of inference to the best explanation, his book is plugged on the back table there, by the way, imply the need to compare the explanatory power of competing hypotheses and or theories. If this process is subverted by metaphysical gerrymandering, the rationality of scientific practice is vitiated. Theories that gain acceptance in artificially constrained competitions can claim to be neither most probably true nor most empirically adequate. Indeed, such theories can only be considered most probable or most adequate in an artificially limited set of options. Moreover, where origins is concerned, only a limited number of basic research programs are logically possible, as Professor Ruse mentions. The exclusion of one of the logically possible programs of origins research by assumption, therefore, seriously diminishes the significance of any claim to theoretical superiority by any other. In my opinion, therefore, a fully rational historical biology must not only address the question which materialistic evolutionary scenario provides the best explanation of biological complexity, but it must also address the question, does a strictly materialistic evolutionary scenario, or one involving intelligent agency, or some other best explain the origin of biological complexity, given all the evidence, including the most current evidence? To insist otherwise is to insist that materialism holds a metaphysically privileged position. Since I see no reason to concede this assumption, I see no reason to concede Professor Ruse's definition of science. Now, in closing, there is one thing that follows for me from my refusal to concede his definition of science. Because I reject Professor Ruse's definition of science, I'm also quite unconvinced by his assurances that common descent is a fact, or as he once put it in one of his more animated moments, a fact, fact, fact. I say this with no particular glee or malice, since I personally could quite easily accommodate common descent to my own belief that life owes its origin in some measure to intelligent design. I am simply unconvinced, however, by the arguments for descent and by the philosophy of science that Professor Ruse and others invoke to make their case for it. Now, it might seem that Professor Ruse's philosophy of science and his arguments for common descent are unrelated. In fact, they are not. He acknowledges as much, or he did so just a few moments ago when he stated that if you think in terms of unbroken law, then evolution makes the most sense. What if you don't think in terms of unbroken law? Is common descent still a fact? Or rather, if you reject the covering law model of science that leads Professor Ruse to speak of unbroken law, is common descent still a fact? Is it even still the best explanation? The fact is that common descent is not a fact. And here Professor Ruse is letting his philosophical predilections about the nature of science drive his conclusions about biological history. Strictly speaking, common descent is an abductive or historical inference, as Professor Ruse himself acknowledges when he speaks more accurately of inferring historical phylogenies. As defined by C.S. Peirce, abductive inferences attempt to establish past causes from the observation of present effects. As such, it is more accurate to refer to common descent as a theory about facts, i.e. a theory about what in fact happened in the past. Unfortunately, such theories and the inferences used to construct them, that is, abductive inferences, can be notoriously underdetermined, that is to say, inconclusive. As Elliot Sober has pointed out, many possible pasts often correspond to a given present state. Establishing the past with certainty, or even beyond reasonable doubt, can therefore be very difficult. especially when the past in question occurred 2 or 3 billion years ago. In my opinion, none of Darwin's 5 arguments for descent, neither fossil progression, biogeographical distribution, homology, embryological similarity, nor the existence of rudimentary organs, establish common descent beyond reasonable doubt. Though I do admit that some of the arguments do strongly suggest the common ancestry of many disparate organisms within limited groups. I also admit that the theory of common descent produces an admirable consilience, but that is just the point. Theories have the property of consilience. Facts do not. In any case, consilience is a matter of degree, and to my mind, the question of whether or not a monophyletic view of biological history can achieve a greater consilience than a polyphyletic view has not yet been established. Indeed, even supposedly invincible arguments from molecular homology depend for their efficacy upon a prior certainty that similarity does not reflect common principles of design. Such certainty in my experience too often seems to have been acquired on the basis of rather naive dismissals of competing worldviews. It also seems to me to have been acquired without adequate reflection upon the implications of the molecular biological revolution, which has now again suggested to many of us the possibility of design.